Hey everyone, hope you're all having an amazing day. Today, we're diving into a deeply emotional story where love, family, and fate collide in a heartbreaking question. Who truly deserves to raise little Nye? The grandmother, bound by blood, or the couple who gave her a second chance at life? Stick around till the end to feel every twist, every tear, and every spark of hope in this touching journey. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next chapter. James leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but heavy with memory as he recounted the story. He told how Diep first met little Nye, completely by chance. Back then, Diep was just helping out in the community, and Nye was a shy, withdrawn child who had already been through too much. Later, they found out Nye's grandmother lived abroad. When she came back, she wanted to take Nye in, but the family refused. There were doubts about where Nye really came from, questions no one wanted to answer. So James and Diep stepped in. They handled the adoption paperwork, met with officials, did everything by the book. For the first time, Nye had a real home. She laughed, played, and slowly began to forget the pain of her early years. Now, as James sat across from the grandmother, the air felt heavier. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, just asked plainly, "Do you really want to bring Nye back into your life? Can you truly take care of her this time?" His tone was kind but firm. He reminded her that before, the family had been too busy to look after the child. James made it clear he wasn't forbidding anything. But Nye's happiness came first. Her voice mattered most. The tension in the room tightened like a string about to snap. The grandmother's eyes glistened. She wanted to meet Nye right away. James hesitated. "Let's meet together. With Diep, with Nye, with the authorities, so everyone can decide what's best," he said. The room seemed smaller as their words collided. Love versus duty. Blood ties versus the bond of care. The old house, with its fading walls and wooden beams, seemed to hold its breath, soaking in the emotion that hung between them. The grandmother tried to explain herself. The family, she said, was ready now. Things had changed. They could give Nye a proper home. But James shook his head gently. "The only thing that matters now is what Nye wants," he said. "She's grown, she understands. We can't decide her future without asking her." The tension slowly gave way to silence. Neither of them wanted to be the villain. Both cared for the same child, just in different ways. James suggested a compromise. "Let's talk again in a few days. Give everyone time to think." The grandmother hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. There was love in her eyes, but also guilt, a quiet confession of the years lost. James watched her leave. The space felt emptier, yet strangely peaceful. He couldn't shake the conflict inside him. The difference between raising a child with love and simply being connected by blood. He thought of Nye's laughter, the way she clung to Diep when afraid. Losing her now felt like losing a piece of his own heart. Still, he wanted to be fair. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it hurt. The scene slowed, filled with quiet introspection. Time itself seemed to pause. The grandmother asked if she could at least set conditions for meeting Diep again. But James explained softly that Diep wasn't fully recovered yet. Her health too fragile for emotional stress. Tears shimmered in the grandmother's eyes. "I just want to see my grandchild," she whispered. "I know," James said, his voice low. But please, let's do this the right way. The audience would feel the emotional weight here, the regret of past choices, the fragile hope for reconciliation, and the unspoken bond tying all of them to Nee's happiness. This was the turning point. The firm edges of confrontation began to soften into understanding. Each character carried invisible burdens, expectations, shame, longing, but for the first time, they were moving towards something that resembled peace. Metaphorically, their hearts were tangled like roots in the same soil, conflicted but connected. The old house around them, with its dim light and still air, mirrored their inner turmoil. Yet through that tension, a spark of compassion began to glow. It was no longer a fight. It was a shared search for what's right. Then came a quiet interruption. A neighbor, someone who had been nearby the whole time, had overheard the conversation. He stepped in, hesitant but sincere. "Maybe you should let Nee decide," he said to the grandmother. "You're not her parents. What matters most is her happiness." His words cut through the heaviness like a breeze after rain. The grandmother listened silently. James nodded, relieved that someone else could see the truth too. They exchanged phone numbers before she left, promising to stay in touch. The neighbor looked at James and said, "You and Diep are the ones who've loved her all these years. Maybe that love is what counts most." That line struck deep. The air seemed to change, the tension slowly melting into something warmer. The neighbor's advice became a quiet catalyst for healing. "Why don't we ask both Anai and Diep what they want?" he continued. "Sometimes the answer's already in their hearts." James sighed, a faint smile forming. For the first time in hours, there was a direction, a way forward that didn't involve anger or guilt. The conversation faded naturally into other things, mundane but grounding. James and John began discussing repairs around the property. The roof didn't need fixing yet, but the wooden panels had to be replaced soon. The neighbor said he'd help if needed. He knew John had just gotten out of prison and was struggling to find his footing. "Call me if you need anything," he said. The gesture, simple as it was, carried hope. The heaviness of the house lifted a little. The grandmother was gone, but her presence lingered, a reminder of love, regret, and all the things left unsaid. James stood quietly by the window. For a moment, he thought of Nai again. The way she laughed, the way she looked at Diep like a daughter looks at her mother. He didn't want to lose that, but he also didn't want to fight anymore. Sometimes, love meant letting go a little. John, meanwhile, thanked the neighbor with quiet gratitude. His emotions were a complex mix of relief, shame, and hope. The scene shifted gently from emotional confrontation to small acts of kindness. The neighbor asked about John's injured finger, worried it might reopen when working on the panels. John smiled faintly and waved it off. "Just call me if the roof leaks again," the neighbor said before leaving. And with that, the air inside the house grew calmer. The argument that had filled it moments ago now gave way to something softer, an unspoken understanding that people, no matter how broken, still tried to do right by each other. In the quiet aftermath, even the creak of the wooden floorboards sounded gentler. Every character carried the same invisible wound, regret. But within that regret, there was also the possibility of forgiveness. The camera would linger on small details, the light filtering through the dusty window, the faint wind outside, the half-fixed roof. all subtle metaphors for healing and rebuilding. As the scene closed, the tension of earlier felt distant. What remained was the slow, steady rhythm of people learning to mend, not just the house, but themselves. Like the roof panels being repaired, their hearts too were being pieced back together. And though uncertainty lingered, hope had quietly taken root. So, later that evening, James returned home. The air outside was cool, the sky painted in shades of dusk. Inside, the small house felt peaceful, but fragile, as if one wrong word could break the calm. Diep was at the table, slowly wiping it down with a damp cloth. Her movements were gentle, but her face was pale. James frowned immediately. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said softly. "You're still recovering." Diep smiled, brushing off his concern. "I'm fine, really. I can handle a little cleaning." But James shook his head. "Resting is part of getting better," he reminded her. "If you push yourself now, you'll only get sick again." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, sitting down. He took the cloth from her hand and began wiping the table himself. "See? Nothing urgent," he said, forcing a smile. "Just let me handle it." After a moment of silence, he started talking again, about his day, about Nye, about everything that had happened. "I took Nye to school this morning," he said quietly. "She looked happy, but I could tell something was bothering her. Maybe she overheard us talking yesterday." Diep's expression softened, sadness flickering in her eyes. Then James mentioned John. "He got into some trouble today. A few of his old workers showed up, still angry about the factory closing. There was a fight." Diep gasped. "Is he okay?" "He'll be fine," James reassured. "I talked to them. No more violence. We'll handle this peacefully." He leaned back, tired but resolute. "I've decided not to sell the land. John can stay here for now. We'll figure something out together." Then he paused, looking at Diep seriously. "By the way, the grandmother came. She asked to take Nye." The words hung in the air. Diep froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. James explained everything. The conversation, the proposal to meet again, his insistence that they ask Nye what she wanted. "We have to think of her happiness first," he said. "If she wants to go with her grandmother, we'll let her. But if she wants to stay with us, we'll protect her, no matter what." Diep nodded slowly, but her eyes glistened. "She's like my own child," she whispered. "I know," James said softly. "That's why we'll do this right." There was a long silence between them, one filled with shared fear, love, and understanding. Then James tried to lighten the mood. "Come on," he said gently, offering his hand. "Let's go see the new house." Diep blinked in surprise. "Now?" "Yeah," he smiled. "It's just up the hill. The air's good there. I want you to see it." They walked slowly together, the sun dipping lower behind the trees. When they reached the top, the view opened wide, rolling hills, scattered houses, a sky fading into gold and lavender. James pointed proudly. "This will be our new home," he said. "See, the kitchen's over there. I'm raising it higher so it's breezy. We'll have a fireplace for the colder nights, a proper sink, tiled floors that won't slip." Diep smiled faintly, imagining it. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He continued, eyes bright with quiet excitement. "We'll plant vegetables here, build a chicken coop with high fences, maybe a pond, ducks swimming under the grapefruit trees." She laughed softly. "You've thought of everything." James looked at her then. his expression gentle but serious. "It's for us," he said. "A place where we can start fresh. No more running, no more worrying." Diep's smile faded slightly. "And if I get sick again?" she asked. "Then you rest," he said firmly. "You don't have to rush anything. We'll take it slow." For a moment, the silence between them felt warm. No tension, just quiet trust. But underneath, both carried the same worry. Nye. The hilltop breeze brushed against them, light and tender. It seemed to carry both their hopes and their fears. James broke the silence. "If Nye decides to go with her grandmother, would you be okay?" Diep didn't answer right away. She stared out at the sunset, her voice trembling slightly when she finally spoke. "I'd miss her every day. But if that's what makes her happy, I'll accept it." James nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say." It was one of those moments where love didn't need many words. Both knew that sometimes caring meant letting go. Even if it hurt, the camera would linger here. On their faces, the quiet emotion in their eyes, the sunset stretching over the hills. The conversation turned gentle again. They talked about the little things, the color of the kitchen walls, the size of the windows, how the fireplace would glow on cold nights. It was a subtle but powerful transition, from anxiety about the past to hope for the future. The space around them, once filled with tension, now radiated peace. James looked at the foundation of the house and smiled. "See this?" he said, tapping the bricks lightly. "Each one means something. Effort, patience, dreams." Diep nodded. "And love," she added quietly. He looked at her, eyes softening. "Yes," he said, "and love." The metaphors came naturally, the rising walls symbolizing their rebuilding, the steep hill mirroring life's challenges. As they walked back down, Diep's steps were slower, her body still weak, but her spirit stronger. She glanced at James. "Do you think Nye will forgive me if she leaves?" He stopped and looked at her. "Diep, there's nothing to forgive. You gave her love. That's what she'll remember." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "You always know what to say." He smiled back, though deep down, he was just as uncertain. The scene would close in a soft, reflective tone, the two of them walking hand in hand down the path, the new house behind them like a symbol of hope rising from the past. The light from the setting sun wrapped around them in gold, as if blessing their quiet determination. Even with their doubts, even with their pain, they carried something stronger. Belief. Belief that love, no matter how tested, could heal. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the grass around their feet. James looked ahead and said, "We'll get through this, together." Diep nodded, her smile trembling but real. Behind them, the unfinished house stood tall on the hill, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The scene lingered just long enough for the audience to feel the contrast, the pain of uncertainty against the comfort of shared purpose. And as the screen faded to twilight, a quiet narration might echo the theme of the story. Sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones made out of love. And sometimes, what we build together is stronger than what blood alone can hold. The last shot, Diep resting her head on James's shoulder as they walk home, captures the essence of everything they've endured: regret, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. It's not a conclusion, but a continuation, a pause before the next chapter in their lives. Because healing, like building a house, takes time. And even in the face of loss, they found something unbreakable. The quiet strength of love that chooses again and again to stay.
In the emotional story, James and Diep face a fateful dilemma when Nhi's long-lost grandmother suddenly returned, asking to take the child back. Years ago, Diep and James adopted Nhi after her family abandoned her, giving her love and stability. Now, torn between blood, tears, and the bond of care, they must decide what truly best for Nhi. Tension rises as the grandmother insists on her rights, while James believes only Nhi's happiness should matter. Amid heartbreak and reflection, both sides confront guilt, love, and forgiveness. With support from kind neighbors, conflict slowly turns to understanding. In the end, as James and Diep dream of a new home and future, they realize that love isn't defined by lying. It's built through compassion, sacrifice, and the courage to let go.